June 1944. The wind howled over the English Channel as thousands of ships gathered in a silent armada, their decks trembling under the weight of destiny. Inside one of those steel monsters sat a strange, secret invention. A machine so absurd that even soldiers laughed when they first saw it. A tank that floated. It looked like madness, wrapped in canvas and hope. But beneath that strange contraption lay the work of an engineer who was not famous, not decorated, not even meant to be remembered. His name was Nicholas Straussler, a quiet, stubborn man who believed that machines could do what men alone could not. As the Allied invasion of Europe hung by a thread, his crazy idea would roll straight into the storm and change the fate of D-Day itself. Long before the beaches of Normandy turned red with blood, a different kind of war was being fought, in drawing rooms, workshops, and quiet laboratories across Britain. The year was 1940. France had fallen. Britain stood alone, gasping beneath the shadow of German bombers. The British Army had lost most of its tanks at Dunkirk, and now, if an invasion of Europe ever came, they knew one thing: tanks couldn't swim. And that single truth could doom any beach assault before it began. Nicholas Straussler wasn't a soldier, he was an engineer. Born in Hungary, trained in the art of making machines do the impossible. He'd already built armored cars and amphibious vehicles before the war, but the British military never took him seriously. To them, Straussler was eccentric. The Mad Hungarian, they called him, a man with wild sketches and stranger ideas. But in 1941, he arrived at a Ministry of Supply meeting with something they couldn't ignore: a tank that could float. The idea sounded insane. A 30-ton steel monster drifting like a lifeboat. Every officer in the room could imagine it, sinking instantly into the channel, dragging his crew to the bottom. Straussler smiled quietly, unrolling a design that looked more like a magician's trick than a military plan. Around the hull of a standard tank, he proposed fitting a collapsible canvas screen supported by inflatable rubber tubes. When raised, it would create a watertight skirt, turning the tank into a floating vessel. Propellers mounted at the rear would drive it through Shan. When it reached the shore, the screen could collapse, and the tank could fight on land, ready to fire within seconds. The officers laughed. "A floating tank?" one of them said. "You might as well build a flying battleship." Straussler didn't argue. He simply nodded, rolled up his blueprints, and went back to his workshop. What no one realized was that his determination burned brighter than their doubt. Over the next 2 years, Straussler worked relentlessly, testing, redesigning, and failing again and again. The early models sank in shallow ponds. Canvas tore under pressure. Valves burst. Steel rusted. Each failure might have ended another man's dream. But Straussler refused to quit. He had seen too many lives lost in machines that couldn't reach where they were needed most. In his mind, this wasn't about glory. It was about giving soldiers a chance, a fighting chance, to reach the shore alive. By 1943, his invention finally took form. The British Army called it the duplex drive tank, or simply D tank. It was part tank, part boat. A strange amphibious hybrid with a floating screen that looked fragile but could keep 30 tons of armor above water. The Sherman DD was its ultimate evolution. A US-made M4 Sherman fitted with Straussler's flotation gear. It was tested on rivers, lakes, in rough seas. Soldiers watched in disbelief as it bobbed, turned, and even fired from the water. Some began to call it the miracle tank, but not everyone was convinced. Many commanders still doubted it would ever survive the open sea, and yet, as the Allied invasion of Normandy drew closer, there was no other option. The beaches of France were heavily fortified, mined, wired, and waiting. Without armored support, the first waves of infantry would be slaughtered. Eisenhower's staff needed something that could swim ashore under fire. They turned, at last, to Straussler's creation, the crazy tank that floated. As the night of June 5th approached, Straussler himself stood on the docks of southern England, watching his machines being loaded onto landing craft. He was not in uniform, not part of the invasion force. But in his heart, he knew that everything he'd worked for, every failure, every sleepless night, was about to be tested in fire and salt water. Behind the roar of engines and the whispers of soldiers, He felt a strange quiet, the kind that comes before a storm. The morning of June 6, 1944, began not with sunlight, but with thunder, the deep, endless roar of engines, waves, and war. The English Channel churned under thousands of ships, their wakes crossing like scars across gray water. On board the landing craft of the 4th and 29th U.S. Infantry Divisions sat the strangest machines any soldier had ever seen. Each Sherman tank was wrapped in a thin canvas wall, inflated like a rubber ring, trembling against the cold wind. They were the duplex drive tanks, Straussler's mad invention, ready to face their baptism by fire. Inside each tank, 5 men sat in silence. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. They could barely see over the canvas screens. The engines growled behind them, idling like nervous beasts. No one spoke. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark horizon, lay Normandy, and the heaviest defenses the world had ever seen. Then came the order. Launch the DDS. Ramps clattered. Cold seawater rushed in. One by one, the floating tanks slid off the landing craft and plunged into the black waves. For a heartbeat, they vanished. Crews held their breath, expecting the worst. Then, miraculously, the canvas skirts rose, the tanks bobbed, and propellers began to churn. To the watching soldiers, it looked like a miracle. 30-ton monsters gliding over water like boats. The first tanks turned toward the French coast, their commanders peering through the small periscopes that barely cleared the waves. In their headsets, orders crackled. Quiet, urgent, determined. They were the first armor to enter battle that day, ahead of thousands of men still waiting offshore. But nature had no mercy for miracles. The sea was rougher than expected. Waves climbed 5 to 6 feet high, slamming into the fragile canvas walls. Each surge tested the limits of Straussler's design. Water splashed over the screens. Pumps whined to keep up. Some tanks began to tilt. The men inside could hear the sound of their own breathing, fast, shallow, mixing with the hiss of the sea creeping in. They fought to stay level, to keep moving. Every inch forward was a victory against the ocean itself. Some made it, many did not. Off Omaha Beach, 27 of the 29 launched DD tanks sank before they could even fire a shot. The crews went down with them, trapped inside steel coffins that had tried to float. The soldiers on the landing craft watched in horror, helpless to save them. The sea swallowed the machines one by one, until only bubbles and smoke marked where they had been. But on other beaches, Sword, Gold, and Juno, the story was different. There, calmer waters gave the tanks a fighting chance. The first DDS reached the sand still afloat, their propellers churning until the moment their tracks bit the shore. Canvas skirts dropped. Steel armor rose from the surf. To the Germans watching from their bunkers, it looked like ghosts emerging from the sea. Phantom tanks rising from nowhere. Panic rippled through the defenses. Within minutes, the floating Shermans were firing. Their 75mm guns pounded pillboxes and machine gun nests, clearing the way for infantry trapped under murderous crossfire. One British commander later said, "Those tanks saved D-Day." The miracle was not in the perfection of the design. It was in the courage of the men who trusted it. Each crew knew the risk. They had trained for months, practicing in calm harbors, but no one could have predicted the chaos of that morning. They launched knowing the odds were cruel, but they believed in the mission, and perhaps unknowingly in the mind of the strange Hungarian engineer who had dreamed this madness into life. Far from the beaches, in a quiet testing ground in England, Nicholas Straussler waited for news. He had no way of knowing which of his machines had survived, which had failed, which had burned on the sand. All he knew was that his invention, mocked, doubted, and dismissed, was out there now, carrying men through hell. When the reports finally reached London, they told a mixed story: disaster at Omaha, triumph at Sword. But buried beneath those numbers was something extraordinary, proof that the impossible had worked. Tanks had floated, they had crossed the sea, they had fought and won. That night, as victory messages filled the airwaves, Straussler sat alone with a cup of cold tea, staring at the blueprints spread across his desk. Somewhere in Normandy, under moonlight and smoke, his machines lay silent. Some burned, some broken, some victorious. He would never meet the men who rode them. He would never hear their voices. But without him, thousands more might never have come home. His floating tank, born of ridicule and persistence, had given flesh and steel a second life. The world would remember D-Day for the heroism on the beaches, for the blood and sacrifice. Few would remember the quiet engineer who made it possible for tanks to swim. Yet in that anonymity lay the truest kind of legacy, one built not on fame but on faith, the belief that even in war's darkest hour, one man's impossible idea can become the miracle that changes everything. Nicholas Straussler was not born into war, but into curiosity. Long before tanks and tides, before the smell of oil and gunpowder became his life's language, he was just a boy in Budapest, a child who loved the hum of gears and the whisper of water against metal. Hungary in the early 1900s was a place of invention and instability, where empires rose and crumbled in the same breath. Nicholas grew up amid that chaos, watching men build machines that promised to change the world, only for politics to destroy them. He studied engineering not because it was practical, but because it gave him control over something the world couldn't take from him: creation. In the years before the Second World War, he designed armored cars, amphibious vehicles, and even folding boats for the British War Office, all under his small firm in England. He had fled the growing darkness in Europe, leaving behind family, friends, and a homeland, sliding into alliance with Nazi Germany. When the war began, he was no longer Hungarian nor fully British. He was something in between, a man without a nation, but with a mission. By 1942, the pressure on British engineers was immense. Every invention was measured not in patents, but in lives saved. Factories worked without rest, testing weapons, aircraft, and tanks for a war that consumed everything. In that atmosphere, Straussler's persistence made him an outsider. His accent, his unorthodox methods, his unwillingness to flatter superiors, all of it made him an easy target. Some dismissed him as an eccentric foreigner chasing fantasies. But those who worked beside him saw something else: a relentless, quiet fire. He had no patience for bureaucracy. When a test failed, he didn't write reports or excuses. He went back to the workshop, rolled up his sleeves, and tried again. His hands were always stained with grease. He never wore gloves, and in the long hours of night, when the war's outcome seemed uncertain, Straussler could be found alone, sketching impossible shapes on scrap paper, whispering to himself about buoyancy, drag, and balance. He knew the ridicule he faced. He heard the laughter behind his back. A tank that swims? Nonsense. Yet he also knew the simple truth that drove him forward. Soldiers were dying because they could not reach their enemy. Invasion after invasion failed because armor could not land where it was needed most. He didn't build machines for glory or empire. He built them for survival. Every bolt tightened on the duplex drive system, every valve tested, every motor adjusted. It was a silent act of defiance against the arrogance of war. He wasn't fighting men, he was fighting limits. When he presented the DD tank to the British and American militaries, he faced an endless wall of doubt. Trials at Helmsley, then Fritton Lake, showed both promise and failure. Tanks floated, then sank. Crews learned, then panicked. Generals grumbled and, "It's too risky," they said, "too strange." But the war was changing. By 1943, as plans for Operation Overlord took shape, someone in command finally understood. The invasion would need miracles, and Straussler's tank was one of them. It wasn't perfect. No invention born under pressure ever was, but it was possible, and that was enough. Still, the acceptance came at a cost. The military claimed the project as their own. The name DD tank became official, but Straussler's name faded into the paperwork. Others would take credit. When the press later called the floating tanks Hobart's Funnies, named after Major General Percy Hobart and his Special Engineering Brigade, Straussler's contribution was reduced to a footnote, an accessory to someone else's glory. Yet Straussler never protested. He never wrote to the newspapers, never demanded medals or parades. In his mind, the real reward was knowing the machines worked, that they saved men's lives. He once told a colleague quietly, "If one tank reaches shore because of me, that is enough." After D-Day, as Europe burned its way toward Liberation, the D tank became a symbol of ingenuity under fire. Engineers around the world studied its design. American manufacturers produced improved versions. Even the Soviets, hearing rumors of tanks that swim, tried to replicate the concept. But Straussler's own life returned to silence. The war ended and he faded into peacetime obscurity. A man too practical for fame, too restless for retirement. He continued designing, filing patents for folding pontoons and armored bridges, his mind always chasing the next problem. Yet history's light had already moved on. His name vanished from textbooks, overshadowed by generals, politicians, and the mythic heroes of Normandy. In the years that followed, Straussler rarely spoke of his greatest invention. Friends remembered him as a man who carried quiet pride but little satisfaction. He had seen his work save lives, but he had also seen it fail. The sunken tanks at Omaha haunted him. Those men who drowned inside the steel he designed were never far from his thoughts. "A machine can't save everyone," he once said, "but it must try." That sentence, perhaps more than any blueprint, defined who he was. For Straussler, engineering was never about perfection. It was about hope, the fragile, stubborn hope that something built by human hands could overcome the impossible. By the time he died in 1966, few remembered his name. His patents gathered dust, his drawings stored away in quiet archives. But the machines he built, the amphibious vehicles, the floating tanks, continued to evolve, shaping the technology of future wars and rescue missions. The same principles of buoyancy and propulsion he tested in muddy English lakes now guide the amphibious armor of modern militaries. His fingerprints, though invisible, remain on the steel of history. Nicholas Straussler never commanded an army. He never stood on a battlefield or heard a medal pinned to his chest. But he did something greater. He gave ordinary soldiers the power to reach the fight, to survive it, and to win. His genius was not loud or cinematic. It was quiet, methodical, human. And in the story of D-Day, a day written in blood, courage, and sacrifice, the echo of his invention still lingers, like a heartbeat beneath the waves that once tried to swallow it whole. When the smoke cleared over Normandy, the beaches were littered with wreckage, shattered landing craft, burned tanks, helmets half buried in the sand. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and death. But amid the devastation, something extraordinary had happened. The Allied invasion had succeeded. The impossible had been done. And in the chaos of that dawn, among the countless men and machines that turned the tide of the war, the floating tank had quietly fulfilled its destiny. It had carried soldiers through waves and gunfire, through disbelief and mockery, into the heart of occupied France. The duplex drive tank, Straussler's strange creation, had done what no machine before it could: bring armor to shore under fire. It was not flawless, it did not save everyone, but it worked when it mattered most. And in war, sometimes that is the only kind of perfection that exists. In the months that followed D-Day, as the Allied forces pushed through Normandy and into the heart of Europe, the DD tanks continued to serve, crossing rivers, fording canals, and supporting assaults that once would have been suicide. They became the silent workhorses of liberation, often uncelebrated, often unseen. Military reports mention them briefly, hidden between casualty lists and logistics updates. For the men who fought beside them, they were simply called the floating Shermans. Soldiers joked about them, cursed them, trusted them. They became part of the landscape of war, strange, resilient, irreplaceable. And then when victory finally came, they disappeared into history as quietly as they had arrived. By 1945, Europe was free. Germany lay in ruins. The world turned its eyes toward rebuilding. The names of heroes filled newspapers and history books: Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, Patton, men whose faces would be remembered for generations. But Nicholas Straussler's name was not among them. His invention had served its purpose, and now it was no longer needed. Governments moved on to new technologies: jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, rocket science. The age of amphibious tanks faded into the background, buried beneath the glamour of atomic power. The duplex drive was quietly retired, its surviving models left to rust in depots and scrapyards across Europe. Some were scrapped for metal, others sent to museums, their faded paint and torn canvas barely hinting at the role they once played in saving a generation. Yet, beneath that silence, the legacy of Straussler's design was far from dead. Military engineers continued to study it, quietly incorporating its principles into new vehicles. The amphibious assault carriers of the 1950s, the floating bridges of the Korean War, the specialized rescue craft that could reach flooded towns. Every one of them carried echoes of Straussler's mind, his stubborn refusal to accept that steel could not float. And beyond the military, his influence rippled into peacetime invention. Lifeboats that deployed faster, pontoons that inflated in seconds, civil defense vehicles that could cross rivers in disaster zones. He had designed for war, but his ideas survived because they saved lives in peace. Still, recognition eluded him. Even after the war, official records rarely credited his name. The Hobart's Funnies, the collection of experimental armored vehicles used by the British 79th Armored Division, received all the attention. The world remembered the generals who approved them, not the man who built them. Straussler's patents existed, his drawings were archived, but his story was never told. Decades passed. By the 1960s, few engineers even knew who had invented the floating tank. In the quiet corners of history, his name faded. Not erased by malice, but by neglect. The war had produced too many heroes, and the ones who worked in silence were the easiest to forget. But history has a way of keeping secrets until the world is ready to listen again. In the late 20th century, as military historians began digging through archives, Straussler's name resurfaced. His early patents for amphibious vehicles were rediscovered, his technical papers studied by scholars, fascinated by how such a crude, improvised design could have survived the fury of D-Day. They found evidence of his correspondence with the British Ministry of Supply, letters filled with quiet conviction and technical detail, written by a man who clearly understood what he was building and why it mattered. Slowly, the narrative shifted. The DD tank was not merely one of Hobart's funnies. It was the brainchild of Nicholas Straussler, the outsider who had refused to give up. In some ways, his story mirrored that of the tanks themselves, dismissed, doubted, nearly forgotten, but never sunk. The floating tank was more than a machine. It was a metaphor for resilience. It taught engineers that weight could be lifted, that even steel could float if designed with enough care and courage. And though the world never gave Straussler the fame it owed him, his spirit lived on in every invention that defied gravity, water, or doubt. Today, only a handful of DD tanks remain. One sits in the Tank Museum at Bovington, England, a ghost of a time when the world believed in miracles built by hand. Its canvas screen, patched and faded, still bears the creases of that June morning. Visitors walk past it, reading the small plaque that mentions the D-Day landings. Few stop long enough to imagine the men inside, listening to the waves slap against the canvas, praying the pumps would hold. Fewer still know the name of the man who made it possible. But those who do understand that they are not just looking at a machine, they are standing before one man's dream, a dream that floated. Nicholas Straussler's invention never roared across victory parades. It never became a symbol of power or conquest. But in the greatest amphibious invasion in history, it became something greater. Proof that ingenuity, even born in obscurity, can save nations. Every turning propeller, every inch gained on those stormy beaches, whispered the same truth, that courage does not always wear a uniform, and genius does not always stand in the spotlight. The floating tank was not just a tool of war, it was an act of faith, faith in human imagination, in the possibility of survival against impossible odds, and in the belief that even in the darkest storm, something built with hope can still rise above the waves. In the decades after the war, the world grew quieter, but Nicholas Straussler's story never truly ended. The tides of Normandy still shift over rusted wrecks. The ghosts of floating tanks still sleep beneath the sand. On calm mornings and when the sea glows pale under a rising sun, the water seems to remember, the faint outline of a canvas skirt here, a corroded track there, fragments of a miracle half buried in salt and time. The world moves on, as it always does, but history has a way of whispering through the things we choose to forget. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. the hum of an engine struggling against waves, the heartbeat of 5 men inside a steel box that was never meant to float, and the echo of one engineer's defiance against the impossible. The true measure of courage is not found in medals or monuments. It is hidden in the small decisions of those who refuse to accept that something cannot be done. Straussler was never a warrior in the traditional sense. He fought no battles with a rifle, commanded no troops, and carried no flag. His battlefield was a workbench, his weapon a pencil, his uniform a smock stained with oil and dust. Yet his war was just as fierce, a war against doubt, against laughter, against the quiet cruelty of being overlooked. Every rejected proposal, every failed test, every scoff from a superior officer, those were the bullets he faced. And like the soldiers who trusted his invention, he endured because the mission was greater than his pride. In that persistence lies a truth that transcends history. Greatness often begins with someone willing to look foolish. Think of what he built: a tank that could sail, a fortress that could float. It was not supposed to work. Physics mocked it. Logic defied it. Even the sea seemed to conspire against it. And yet, when the world needed it most, it worked. It carried men through hell. That is the quiet miracle of Nicholas Straussler's life. He transformed ridicule into reality, turning an engineer's sketch into a soldier's salvation. His tanks didn't win D-Day alone. No single machine could. But they gave the invasion something priceless: momentum. They gave courage physical form, turning faith into movement. When those canvas screens rose against the waves, they did more than lift tanks. They lifted hope. History often remembers the loudest men, the generals, the strategists, the leaders whose names fill textbooks. But the world is built, more often than not, by those who work in silence, men and women who labor without applause, whose hands shape the invisible gears of destiny. Straussler's life reminds us that history is not only made by those in command, but by those who create the tools that make command possible. His floating tank was not just an invention. It was a declaration that imagination is a weapon too, perhaps the most powerful one humanity has ever possessed. Because while bullets can end lives, ideas can save them. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Nicholas Straussler. Not the tank, not the patents, not even the victory he helped secure, but the example he left behind. The example of a man who dared to dream at a time when dreaming seemed dangerous, who refused to accept the limits the world imposed, who believed that even in war, creation could triumph over destruction. In his quiet defiance lies a lesson for every generation that follows, that progress often begins as heresy, and salvation often wears the face of madness. Standing on the shores of Normandy today, the sea looks peaceful. Children play where soldiers once fell. The waves roll in and out, erasing footprints, softening scars. Yet beneath that calm lies the memory of 1,000 acts of impossible courage. Among them, invisible but enduring, is the story of a man who turned steel into something that could float. He never lived to see his name honored, but he didn't need to. His reward was already written in the waves, in the tanks that reached the shore, in the soldiers who stepped onto sand instead of sinking into the sea, in the world that rose again because of people like him. And so, the tale of Nicholas Straussler is more than a footnote in history. It is a reminder that the extraordinary often hides behind the ordinary, that even the quietest hands can shape the loudest moments in time. His tanks may have been forgotten by name, but not by purpose. They still whisper the same message to anyone who listens. Never stop believing in what the world calls impossible, because sometimes all it takes to change the course of history is one stubborn engineer, a sheet of canvas, and the unshakable faith that even the heaviest things can rise. The sea does not keep trophies. It does not celebrate victories or mourn the dead. It only remembers in silence. Yet beneath the shifting tides of Normandy, pieces of Nicholas Straussler's dreams still lie scattered. Twisted metal, fragments of canvas, rusted bolts once meant to defy the deep. They rest quietly in the sand, almost forgotten, like bones of an ancient creature that once tried to rise above its nature. Every wave that touches those remains carries with it a memory of a moment when men believed that even a tank could float, and of an engineer who refused to bow to the word impossible. History, after all, does not always belong to those who win the battles. Sometimes it belongs to those who make victory possible. When the first wave of D-Day began, most soldiers had never even heard of Nicholas Straussler. To them, the swimming tanks were a strange miracle, something half believed, half feared. Many didn't trust them, not until they saw one rise from the water like a creature out of myth, steel glistening with spray, treads clawing toward the beach. Some of those tanks sank before they reached shore, swallowed by the same ocean they had dared to challenge. Others made it, barely, their engines screaming, water sloshing beneath their boots. But the fact that any made it at all was enough to alter the course of history. For every tank that floated, there was a story of a crew that lived, and for every life spared, or odd zero, there was a debt owed to the man who imagined what no one else dared to. Think of what he built: a tank that could sail, a fortress that could float. It was not supposed to work. Physics mocked it. Logic defied it. Even the sea seemed to conspire against it. And yet, when the world needed it most, it worked. It carried men through hell. That is the quiet miracle of Nicholas Straussler's life. He transformed ridicule into reality, turning an engineer's sketch into a soldier's salvation. His tanks didn't win D-Day alone.